Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's class in data methodology. So today we're going to look at a particular method a little bit more in depth, surveys, because this is what you're going to be using for your research project. And we're going to start looking at the different sections of an article. At the end, you're going to be producing a mini article for this class. It won't be as big as, say, a published article, but we're still going to try to include smaller versions of each section. And we're going to go a little bit more in depth into a couple of the kind of early sections, ones that you're going to need to start thinking about now in the first couple of assignments. So kind of choosing your topic and research question, and starting to work on a literature review. So the lecture resource, kind of the primary one used, again, is Trochim and Donnelly. All right, so the first section is Introduction to Survey Research. So surveys are really, really common in many of the social sciences. It's one of the most important areas of measurement. It gives us so much ability to learn about the attitudes or opinions, the values, kind of the implicit biases, and just how people react to different scenarios. We can learn about how people think through different problems, what motivates them. There's so many different things that you can do with surveys. And so there are important methods in many of the different social sciences, particularly those that are interested in public opinion. But surveys don't even have to be on public opinion. They could be about some segment of the population. So you can look at, say, elites and do a survey of elites in a certain area. So government elites or economists, stuff like that, or important members of society, so kind of social elites, celebrities, if you had access, and do a survey there and gain ideas. So they're not all just of like mass public opinion. Some of them are focused on certain subsamples that we may be interested in. So types of surveys can generally be divided between questionnaires and interviews. So questionnaires are instruments that the respondent completes, and interviews are completed by the interviewer based on what the respondent says. And so in practice, the questions asked in questionnaires and interviews can often resemble each other greatly. It just depends on who's kind of completing it. If it's a questionnaire, it's the respondents completing it. If it's an interview, there's someone who's actually involved in giving the survey. So kind of reading the questions and noting down the answers. There's some important differences between both in terms of advantages and disadvantages we'll talk about later. You'll have a choice. It's possible that you'll do interviews or questionnaires. Given the current context of COVID-19, questionnaires are probably the more likely scenario for you, unless you happen to be telephoning people. But we'll talk to the different types of questionnaires and interviews, kind of how they can be delivered. And then when you're thinking through your project, you can see which one is most suitable to you. So types of questionnaires. So this isn't going to be an exhaustive list of questionnaires, but kind of some of the more commonly used one. So mail surveys is probably the original version of one of the ones that was originally most common. It's probably been supplanted by one that we'll see later, but so many surveys in social sciences were done by mail surveys. So essentially it's a paper and pencil survey that's sent to respondents through the mail. So you mail the survey and they can either drop it off somewhere or mail it back. So you provide the ability for them to mail it back. And once they complete it, this is nice that you can get surveys to many people across a wide area. So if you had to visit everybody, that would be a problem. Response rates can be a problem. Once if somebody gets it in the mail and they have to complete it and then mail it back, are they actually going to go about doing so? Group administered questionnaires. This is a survey that's administered to respondents in a group setting. So you're not reading the questions to a group who are in a group setting, but at the same time, but everyone's kind of in a group and they're all completing it. So think of kind of your course evaluations in class, right? So usually another teacher comes in, right? And they don't read each question to you, but they give you the kind of the broad instructions about, this is the purpose of the questionnaire, this is what you should do. And then they hand you the questionnaire, you fill in all the different answers about the course and the instructor based on you reading the questions, and then hand it back in. Electronic surveys are really growing in popularity. So there are a wide range and increasing variety of technologies for electronic surveys, but most of them fall into two categories: email surveys or web surveys. Most of the survey experiments I've done have been web-based surveys. They have a lot of advantages. They also have some disadvantages, but in terms of ease of getting respondents, web surveys can be and email surveys can be really useful. It's probably what most of you will do for this project, but we'll talk more about that when we start getting into design elements next week. So email surveys are questionnaires sent directly to the respondent's email address. And a web survey would be the respondent must visit a website. So there are certain websites that are designed that like kind of host different surveys. And so someone who say wants to be completing surveys can kind of sign up here, look through different surveys they want to do, and then complete them, sometimes often for some form of payment. Of interviews. So we have focus groups. Similar to group administered questionnaires, these are done in groups, and focus groups are a qualitative measurement method where input on one or more focus topics is collected from participants in a small group setting where the discussion is structured and guided by a facilitator. So rather than you're just asking a series of questions to one person, here you're asking a series of questions to a group. And so you're not just getting kind of answers of individuals, you're also getting answers of individuals, but also group discussion. So you can see how kind of the conversation develops. And so other people could be hearing what others are saying. You can have responses between different individuals depending on how the interview is structured. Telephone surveys, so a personal interview that is conducted over the phone. So I'm sure all of you have had calls from businesses, from media, or for survey companies, or doing surveys for business, media, or government, asking your opinion on a purchase you made, or on a political issue, or who you want to vote on, or for a social issue, or whatever it might be. Well, that's a form of interview, and that's a telephone survey. So a personal interview is conducted over the phone. The telephone interviewer will read you the questions, give you the list of possible options, and you'll be asked to provide your answer. So selecting the survey method that's best for you. So it's a questionnaire or interview better for answering your research question. What type of questionnaire or interview? In order to choose the proper method, consider the following issues. So population issues. Do you have a list of the members of the population, or you have to go find them? If you have a list of the members of the population, you can, just mail them a survey or send them an email or something like that. But if you have to go find them, if you don't know who these people are who are members of your population, then you have to go out and find them. And so, for example, an email or a mail survey probably wouldn't be appropriate. Does your population have the ability to answer a questionnaire, right? So do they have the skills? So answering a questionnaire requires the ability to read and understand questions, usually on your own without help from any interviewer or researcher. So does your population have the ability to be able to do that? Is your population multilingual? Do you know the language of each member? If you're dealing, for example, if you're doing a survey in Quebec of all Quebecers, would you be able to, unless you know whether members of a particular household are English or French, would you know you wouldn't be able to do a mail survey unless you included both languages? But you wouldn't want to just be randomly sending out English surveys and hoping that the people you get happen to be English. Now, if you knew what language each household spoke, that wouldn't be as much of a problem. Will the population cooperate with your questionnaire, or do you have to earn their cooperation? So particularly if you're dealing with populations that are more vulnerable, just kind of mailing a questionnaire or emailing a questionnaire um, isn't likely to work. It's going to take time for the researcher to earn uh, uh, the trust. And so it's probably going to have to be some form of face-to-face interview. Uh, so there are many. So kind of the corollary of the mail interview is where it's kind of at the person's home is face-to-face interviews where an interviewer goes around and knocking on doors and to get opinions. So you see that sometimes in around elections where you have surveyors who are going around knocking on doors and asking about preferences. Um, and so that may be more useful. How geographically dispersed is your population? So if it's a dispersed population, going around yourself or conducting focus groups. For example, say you're only located in Montreal, you want to be surveying or interviewing members of from across the country. Conducting focus group in Montreal is not going to help you get access to the entire population. So that wouldn't be a suitable method. Sampling issues. Do you have the relevant information about members of your sample? So even if you know, so before we talked about, do you know who's in your population? Even if you know who's in your population, do you have the information needed to be able to sample them? So do you have the mailing addresses or the email addresses or stuff like that? Or do you have to go around? Can all members of the population be sampled? And will response rates be low? Different methods have different likely response rates. And different samples have different likely response rates. So for example, we talked about things like mail surveys can have very low response rates because some of the mailing will get lost on the way. Some of the mailing, once they get it, the person isn't going to complete the survey. Some of the people who then complete the survey will forget to actually go mail it. And then some of the people who actually try mailing it back, it'll get lost in the mail. And so in terms of the number of surveys that get back to you, it can be quite low. You're also then potentially worried about, is there a bias in who actually answered it? Are the people who answered it different than the people who didn't answer it? And so you're getting a true picture of your sample. So these are considerations in choosing your design is how can I get the best response rate given my sample? Question issues. So what types of questions will you need? Open-ended questions or closed-ended? So an open-ended question is where you ask, or let's start with the closed-ended question. So a closed-ended question, say on an exam, would be, an A, B, C, D. So a multiple choice question where we ask the question and we give you a list of options that you have to choose from. So the person can't go off script, they've got to select one of those options. An open-ended question would say be an essay question. From kind of the exam perspective, we ask you a question and then we let you take it in the direction you want to go. So an interview would be, what do you think about this issue? And then the respondent's able to say whatever they want. Now you can do this in a questionnaire or in an interview, for example, in a questionnaire, you can give the option for the person to write, and in an interview, you can give them the option to just, talk and for as long as they want if you're doing open-ended questions. This will partially be determined by, do you know all the possible responses? If you don't know all the possible responses to the question, then a closed-ended question is difficult. Because remember, you want all of your possible options to be exhaustive. So you want all possible responses to be included. So if you don't know everything that somebody might say, and so you give them an A, B, C, D choice, and their response is E, right? That's not going to work in a closed-ended question. How complex are the questions? So that's in terms of how you want to be delivering it. You'll be wanting to think through how complex are the question, and will filter questions be needed? So filter questions are based for questions where are based on the answer. You may get follow-up questions. So it might be, for example, have you filed your taxes in the past year? If you answer yes, you get a follow-up question about or say if you say yes, you move on to the next question. If you say no, there's a follow-up question of when was the last time that you've paid your taxes. So these are questions that many different surveys include, but they're easier to include in some designs than others. For example, in a mail survey, right, you don't want to be giving, too many of, if you answered yes to question 1, go to question 2. If you answered no, jump to question 5. You're very quickly getting a lot of people lost. I mean, I know this is how, some things like taxes are sometimes done, but and government documents that sometimes include these type of questions. But as much as possible, you'd probably want to be avoiding that, because you're going to get a lot of bad responses. People not going to the questions they're supposed to go to, people getting frustrated and giving up, people getting confused. With a web survey, this isn't as difficult because many of the kind of survey programming things on the web, you can have it automatically where if they answer yes, a certain question comes up. If they answer no, another one comes up. So the respondent doesn't have to do anything. So if you need filter questions, something like a web-based one might be better, or an interview where the interviewer could be the one who's handling the task of choosing what the next question is. Content issues. Are the respondents likely to know about the issue? Are you going to have to be prompting them with additional information? If you're going to have to be giving them additional information in order to answer the questions, then you're going to want a method where a surveyor is present, right? So a telephone interview, a group administered questionnaire, something like that. Will they need to look up information? So if they're not going to have all the relevant information with them, then say a focus group or a group-based one might not work unless they're told in advance to bring the information. Even a telephone one, they're probably not going to go in a lengthy search for information and then come back on the telephone. Bias issues. So can social desirability be avoided? So sometimes when you're doing a survey, and any type of survey really, the person's going to answer the questions based on what they think the interviewer wants or the researcher wants, because they want to please the interviewer. And when the interviewer is present, that's more likely to be a problem. So particularly in face-to-face context, they may want to be pleasing to the researcher. This is also present, say, on a phone interview. It can occur in non-face-to-face ones too, where they're still trying to be agreeable, but because there's less interaction between the researcher and the participant, that's less likely. Will interviewers deliver a consistent interview, or group administered ones? I suppose also the person who's administering it. But this is most important with interviews. If the interviewer is giving kind of a different reading of the questions each time, or coding the responses differently each time, then that's a real problem to whether you're going to be giving a consistent instrument. And we talked about when we were discussing internal validity, how it's important to have a consistent instrument, or else you don't know whether the effects that you're finding or the differences that you're finding are due to kind of difference in instrument or difference in treatment. And even if it's not a causal study, you wouldn't even be so if you're just looking, say, for a correlation or accurate description. Even if you're just trying to get accurate description of what the population thinks, if the interviewer is delivering the question in a different way, that's distorting the responses. You're not even getting an accurate description of what the population thinks. And can false respondents be identified? Other things to think about when you're choosing kind of your survey method are things like cost, facilities, time, and personnel. So each of these different survey methods have different costs in terms of implementing it. So mailing your instruments, having people, having interviewers or paying interviewers, potentially paying participants depending on the type of study. And so all of these different costs need to be factored in, and you need to choose a method that fits your budget. Facilities, so things like focus groups And group administered surveys need facilities where people can come in and answer questions. Telephone interviews usually need rooms with telephones where the interviewers can place the calls. Time. So a mail survey, for example, compared to web, email, or telephone surveys, a mail one, for example, is going to take longer because you've got to factor in the time for the survey to be mailed to the people, time for them to actually respond to, like complete the survey, and then time for it to be mailed back. So if you need to be getting your data in much quicker, say a mail survey won't be appropriate. If time's not a factor, then a mail survey may work for you. And personnel. So different types of surveys require different number of people. So for example, if it's emailing or web-based one, all you need really is one person to program the survey, and then you need to analyze it after, but you don't need many people to be delivering it. It could be 1 to 2 people entire for the project. Same thing for mail. I mean, a little bit more time consuming because you've got to put them all into the envelopes, but still not requiring a large staff. Something like a large phone interview requires a large number of telephone interviewers who all need to be trained in delivering telephone interviews. So for example, something like that would require a larger number of personnel. All of this will also feed back into costs. So larger personnel typically also is associated with larger costs. Here's a table that we're not going to go through exhaustively. And again, you don't have to worry too much about them, because not all of these options are going to be ones that are just automatically suitable for you. For example, in our time frame, particularly in an intensive summer course, a mail questionnaire is just going to be out of the question. You're not going to have the time to mail it to the people that respond and then mail back and analyze it. That's just not possible. A focus group, unless you're able to do kind of a Zoom focus group, also isn't particularly, or Teams or Skype or whatever focus group. Also with COVID-19, it's not particularly feasible. Things like face-to-face, unless you have extremely large families in your group and you have a lot of family members who can respond, because of social distancing, even face-to-face interviews will be more difficult in this one. Normally, face-to-face is probably an option that many would have selected, say, during the regular fall-winter semesters where we're on campus, where you could just, do a student sample of Champlain students, give it out to, people in the hallways. But that won't be as effective in this particular case. So look through, these are kind of so the different kind of considerations and whether it works with the form of questionnaire. I want to talk briefly about survey experiments too, because survey experiments are a type of experiment. They could be either questionnaire or interview, but it's a type of experiment that's definitely grown in popularity in the last decades among social researchers, because it allows, compared to surveys, gives us a greater ability to make causal claims. Whereas your typical survey, without an experiment, you can get a lot of descriptive data, you can get a lot of correlational data, but getting up to the causal level is much more difficult. So a survey experiment is any survey in which there's an embedded experiment. So if there's an experiment within a survey, it's a survey experiment. Participants are randomly assigned to receive either the treatment or control version of the experiment. The control and treatment versions are identical, except for a difference of a word or sentence in a question or scenario. So everybody gets kind of the same survey largely, except there's going to be a small part that's changed between both versions. And what we're looking at is how does that difference produce response to certain questions. And because all other parts of the survey are the same, because we've randomly assigned it, we know that the difference in the average response in both groups is caused by the treatment. So we are able to find an average treatment effect. And I'm going to be posting several examples of survey experiments and surveys kind of on some different topics. Not exhaustive list of them, because there's thousands of both, but just some good ones that I'm aware of, just to kind of give you an idea of how they're structured, but also look at kind of, I'm giving one example here of a survey experiment, but just so you can see kind of some of the different types of surveys that exist, or questions that people are looking at with surveys, some of the different kind of questions people are looking at with survey experiments. And then based on your question, you can see, hey, can I take a method that's similar or approach that's similar to this person? It'll also, because many of them will include examples of questions, once we start getting into question design next week, it'll give you kind of an idea of what type of questions are people using. There's some questions that are pretty typical across most surveys, particularly things like demographic questions. So age, race, gender, education, stuff like that tend to be included in most surveys. So you could also get an idea of kind of the language used in many of those questions. But I want to give kind of a brief example of a really well-known survey experiment that kind of one of the ones that really helped grow survey experiments in psychology, economics, and political science in particular. This originally was kind of more of a economic psychology, but it's certainly grown also and inspired in politics, or perhaps almost largely, predominantly almost in politics now. So here's kind of the scenario. Here's kind of an example of how this is a survey, or how this is an experiment. So all participants, so this is embedded, there's more questions, and so they're completing, they would have completed other kind of similar questions, so say demographic and maybe some psychological or economic. So many of the questions are just the same. You can even have a full-on survey too, so you might just also be asking some things that you're interested in for relational purposes or for descriptive purposes, but you've also got the experiment. So here's kind of, once we're into the experimental part of the study, all participants read the following scenario. Imagine that the US is, and some participants aren't told it's an experiment. Imagine that the US is preparing for the outbreak of an unusual Asian disease, which is expected to kill 600 people. Two alternative programs to combat the disease have been proposed. Assume that the exact scientific estimates of the consequences of the program are as follows. So everybody reads this. Unfortunately, probably the use of unusual Asian disease, it was linguistically, study was in 1981. Well, it's published in 1981. It was probably done earlier. Researcher probably now wouldn't have used unusual Asian disease as the language, particularly right now, given current events. But so everybody sees this. So the disease is expected to kill 600 people. And so they're giving kind of options for how society should proceed. So half the participants read the following details. So there's two possible programs. And so half the participants, there's two different programs that they can choose from. And so for half of them are read about program A and program B. So if program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved. If program B is adopted, there's a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved, and a 2/3 probability that no people will be saved. Then the other half of the participants read the following details. If program C is adopted, 400 people will die. And if program D is adopted, there's a 1/3 probability that nobody will die and a 2/3 probability that 600 people die. Now, there's some interesting things about these different scenarios. And in particular, so in all four scenarios, 200 of the 600 people will be alive and 400 of the people will be dead. That's true across, on average. So in program A and C, they're guarantees. In program B and D, they're averages. So if we take the average of what should happen, right? So if this were done multiple times, on average, based on the probabilities, 200 people will be alive. So kind of the expected number, if you think of kind of relative probabilities, you would have 200 people being alive. So in terms of the total number of people alive, all four scenarios are the same. The other thing to note is that program A and C are completely identical in terms of 200 people will be alive, and it's a certainty. So 100% certain that 200 people will be alive at the end, and 400 people will be dead. And program B and D are completely equivalent in the sense that there's kind of an expected value, there's an expected outcome that 200 people will be alive, and the probabilities are the exact same. So there's in both cases, there's a 1/3 probability that everybody will be alive at the end and nobody will die. And there's a 2/3 probability that everybody will die and nobody will be alive. And that's the same in programs B and D. The only difference is the wording between A and C and between B and D. The only difference is the wording. But other than that, in terms of the risk, so what is the risk, or is it a sure thing? That's the only difference between A and B, and then between C and D is essentially the risk, because the expected values are the same. But for those given the choice between A and B, 72% chose program A. So program A was the sure thing. 200 people will be alive, and it's a sure thing. For those given the choice between C and D, 22% chose program C. And remember, again, program C is the same as program A. So we get 200 people will be alive, and it's a sure thing. And so all of these scenarios, so A and C were the same, B and D were the same in terms of risk and how many people are alive. The only thing that was different was in terms of the wording of whether we're going to talk about people will be saved or people will die. That's the only difference between these scenarios, is how it was, and this kind of was the birth of the study into what we call framing. So how it was framed, is it framed in terms of people will be saved or people will die? And that led to a changing of how much people were tolerant of risk. And so this study has been replicated many times, but also has inspired so many other studies looking at how different language, so different frames of a problem in terms of different values or in terms of different details can lead to different levels of support for different options. And so many of the studies, actually, the survey experiments I'm going to be posting on Leia, are examples of framing studies that have come out in later decades. So when you're thinking about for kind of your projects, your ultimate goal will be to identify a possible explanation for your research question. So you're going to have a research question, right? And you're going to have a thesis about what you believe the answer is to be. So the ultimate goal is establishing a causal relationship. The theory you develop and the design you select will determine how strong your causal claim will be. Because remember, when we looked at kind of the different types of designs, experiments are very strong at being able to make causal claims. Non-experimental designs are much weaker in being able to make causal claims. So there's some like process tracing, but you're not really be able to be doing process tracing here, that can make fairly strong causal claims. But most of the different non-experimental designs suffer either in terms of they're not able to establish temporal precedents, they're not able to eliminate alternative, or they're not able to eliminate alternative explanations. Most are able to at least establish correlation, but even then, that's not necessarily a guarantee with some of your small end studies, so your case studies. But because we're going to have multiple responses, correlation shouldn't be a problem. But the question will be, are you able to show temporal precedence, and are you able to show or eliminate alternative explanations? So you have a choice. You'll be able to choose whether you're doing a survey experiment. And this is going to depend partially on your question. And It's going to depend partially on your question, and even more so, it's really going to be determined by what your theory is. What is your explanation? So as you're reading through, so as you're choosing your question, and we're going to talk about it later, you're going to want something that there's a possibility that we can even do a survey. And then as you're reviewing the literature, kind of starting to work on your literature review, and then eventually choosing your theory, you're going to want to be thinking about what design implications this have, particularly if you're really interested in trying a particular design. There are going to be design implications based on what your thesis, so what you think the explanatory variable is. So if the explanatory variable is something that you can manipulate yourself, so for example, wording of a question, details in a hypothetical story, and there's several examples. So in this case, it was a wording of the question: how many people will be saved, or in this scenario, how many people will be saved, how many people will die. And so that was how it was a change in the frame, so the wording of the details in the hypothetical story. So in this case, if you're able to manipulate the wording, so if you're able to manipulate, say, the frame in that case, the explanatory variable, random assignment of participants to control and treatment conditions is possible. So you can randomly have it that some people get, 600 people will die, and or 200 people will die, and or 400 people will die, and randomly assign some people to get 200 people will be saved. So you can have random assignment to condition. The study would satisfy the 3 criteria for causal inference: temporal precedence. Your manipulation definitely comes before your outcome, because you're giving the manipulation and then you're asking the follow-up questions. So you know temporal precedence. You can establish correlation. And elimination of alternative hypotheses is done by virtue of having multiple groups and random assignment. So elimination of alternative hypotheses will control everything except for possible social threats to validity. If you're not doing a survey experiment, you'll be doing a survey. And so then there's a couple of different options for how the survey will go. So if the explanatory variable is not something that you can manipulate, random assignment to conditions not possible. The study will not be able to satisfy the 3 criteria for causal inference, and the test of the theory will be weaker. Right? Like I said last time, you can still, if you find a correlation, say that the correlation fits with what the theory would expect, but you haven't shown that one causes the other. So it's a much weaker conclusion about whether the theory, it's a much weaker test of the theory. So if the explanatory variable is stable, for example, gender, race, personality. I know gender can change, but on average, or we could go with sex, but on average, gender stays stable throughout lifetime. Things like race, personality, things that are relatively given throughout the lifetime. So if the explanatory, or if it's something that's at least stable in recent time frame, then your study will satisfy the correlation and temporal precedence criteria, but you'll not be able to fully eliminate alternative hypotheses. So for example, if you're taking, you think race explains difference in opinion on a particular subject, right? You know that assignment to race, which occurred at birth, precedes the opinion, because the opinion was formed at some point during lifetime. Same thing with personality traits. Personality traits are relatively stable throughout lifetime, hence trait. So you can assume that the trait was assigned before the opinion. So in this case, you weren't able to manipulate it, right? So you don't have random assignment, but you still have temporal precedence. But you can't eliminate alternative hypotheses because you still have your multiple group threats to validity, because you did not control assignment. But you are able to at least achieve 2 of the 3 criteria for causal inference. So it's not as strong of a causal claim, or it's not a causal claim period, but it's not as strong of a test of a theory. But it's as a survey experiment, but it's still got some benefits. It's still not a bad test. And then if the explanatory variable is not stable, for example, political, economic, or social attitudes or opinions, then your study will satisfy the correlation criteria, but you likely won't be able to establish temporal precedents and fully eliminate alternative hypotheses. So you don't have random assignment. So eliminating alternative hypotheses is a problem. And you also don't have temporal precedence because you don't know if you're looking, say, at the correlation between two different opinions. Does your opinion on this affect your opinion on this? You're not going to know which of these two opinions, in most cases, you're not going to know which of these two opinions came first or which of these two attitudes came first. And it's because you don't know which one came first, you can't say that one of them caused the other because you don't know what the order was. It may have been that the one that you think is dependent was actually independent, or could have been some third variable caused both of these opinions. And so you're not going to have temporal precedence. So this would be your weakest. But, in some cases, right, like we still need to test claims where we're not able to manipulate and where it's not a stable trait. We still need to be able to do tests of this. So if you're choosing and your explanation is that it's that you think you think this attitude causes the other attitude, this last version is still a good study to do. It's still a useful study. You just have to be aware of what it means about what types of claims you can make for testing your theory. So in terms of whether to select the survey or survey experiment, both have advantages and disadvantages. So the survey experiment is likely more difficult to design. So since you'll be creating your treatment, you need to make sure to design a treatment that actually manipulates the explanatory variable. So for example, if a study argues that emotional state produces the outcome, the treatment must actually be able to induce the emotion. So if you're saying that like anger produces a difference in opinion compared to happiness, and you need to be able to have a treatment that experimentally manipulates happiness and anger. And there are studies that do it, but it takes a lot of very careful design and testing to make sure that your study's actually manipulating anger and happiness, because if it's not, you still might find an effect, but you don't have construct validity. I don't suggest you go into the realm for this course of manipulating emotion because it is quite difficult. But that's just kind of an example. So whatever your treatment is, you're going to be need to be careful that you come up with a treatment that actually fits kind of the construct of your independent variable. So what your theory says should be doing it, you need to come up with a treatment. And so this does take a little bit more time in designing. The survey will likely be more easy to write. It will be probably easier to design. Now, it's still not easy because you still have to come up with really good questions, really good measures. You still got to be sure that what your measures, the way you're operationalizing kind of the concepts from your theory. You still need to make sure that these measures are actually measuring those concepts. So in both cases, it's not to say that one's easy. It both will take a lot of work. But the survey is probably going to be easier because of you're not designing kind of your own treatment. For example, in the case of if you're, say, doing race or sex, right? You don't have to work on assigning those things. Those things are already manipulated. So that part of the work's already done for you. But the survey write-up, so when you're actually writing the paper, it's going to take less time to design, but the writing of the paper is going to probably be a little bit more difficult, right? Because the methods and analysis section are both going to have a careful discussion of threats to internal validity and perhaps temporal precedence, right? So you're going to have to be honest about that. Even though you're trying to test a causal theory, you're not doing a causal study, or your test isn't causal in the sense of you're violating some of the things that are required for making causal claims. So you're going to have to be addressing the different threats to internal validity that exist in your study. You're going to have to be discussing concerns potentially about temporal precedence if you're doing the ones that kind of that third version. That's going to be a slightly more difficult write-up, and you're going to have to be more careful on what claims you're making in your conclusion about how much support you had for your theory. All right, so structures of a peer-reviewed article. So sections, generally, you're not going to be needing all of these in your final project. So you're not going to be needing an abstract in the project, but I just wanted to include what it is. So an abstract, you're going to find this in almost all journal articles, all the ones I'm posting, I believe that abstracts. And they're actually incredibly useful. When you're doing your literature review, abstracts are your best friend in terms of, so a title is often not going to tell you enough about whether the study is actually useful for your project or for your literature review. And you also probably aren't going to want to be reading the entire article to figure out if this study is potentially useful to you, because that's a large waste of time if the answer is no. So an abstract gives you a really quick way of figuring out, not definitive, but really quick way of figuring out whether this study is probably going to be useful for your paper. So it's rather one that you want to kind of put aside and say, I need to read this for my lit review. And so the abstract is just going to give you a lot of details. Just reading the abstract is really useful in terms of understanding what this study is about. So then when you're reading it, it makes more sense. So the abstract is a summary of the problem, research question, thesis, theory, method, and findings. So kind of all of that condensed usually into about 200 or 250 words. So real brief kind of bare bones summary of what was done in this paper. So what were they trying to answer? What was the answer that they proposed? How did they try to test this theory? And what did they find? So the introduction comes usually after the abstract. So the introduction is the first part of the paper itself. And it'll usually be kind of defining what is the social issue. So what's the problem that the paper is trying to address, either a theoretical problem sometimes or kind of social problem. What is the research question? So based on the problem that we have, what specific question is the study trying to address? And what is the thesis statement? So what is the argument that you're making? A good intro also usually, we don't like academic papers actually to be mystery novels. So after the thesis statement, you're usually going to briefly kind of summarize your results. Literature review. So what does the academic literature say about the research question? And contextualize the paper within the wider academic conversation on the topic. Right, so you're not the first person to be writing about this research question. So kind of what have other people been saying, and kind of, so this way we can situate your study as it's not kind of like just appearing out of nowhere, but you're building on what others have done. We're going to talk more about the literature review soon, because you're going to have to write one at the beginning of next week. Theory. What is specific theory that will be that we'll be testing in the paper? It includes what are the general principles of the theory, what assumptions does it make, and what does it say specifically about the research question, what testable hypotheses can be derived. So based on the thesis, the argument you're making, you're going to have a theory that kind of supports the kind of the logic of why this argument makes sense. So if you're saying that it's because of factor X, what assumptions we need to be making that help explain why factor X would answer our question, would produce the results. So you start with what are the general principles of the theory. So what does the theory say in general? So forgetting about kind of the case or your subject at first, in general, kind of just lay out what are the core assumptions of this theory, how does it believe that the world works? And then you want to be relating it to kind of the case or your specific problem. Or so what does it specifically say about the research question? What testable hypotheses can be derived? And in terms of hypotheses, so it's kind of specific statements of prediction. Methods. How will the theory be tested? Full description of the sample and design. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the selected method? So you're going to want to talk about your sampling, what the specific method, and then describe the method. So if it's a survey, talk about so what was your sampling method? How was it delivered? How was the questions constructed? Stuff like that. And then strengths and weaknesses of the method. Survey, experiment. You're definitely going to want to be talking through your treatment. So, for example, in the Tversky and Kahneman example that I gave before with the disease, the framing one. So you'd want to be giving, for example, the text of what everybody got, and then the manipulation and the control version, or the two manipulations, so that the reader understands this is exactly when we're saying the results. We're providing the results of there's a difference. People understand there's a difference in what. Results in an analysis. So what did the data say, and how does it fit with the hypotheses? And then conclusion, based on the causes identified, what concrete steps can be taken to improve the situation. Provide a brief overview of the topic, research question, theory, thesis, and results. And what are the potential directions for future research? So the first, it's kind of what we'd call policy recommendations. So because most social science research is trying to improve kind of a social situation, based on what we've learned, what steps can we do to address? So if we've got a problem and we find that something's causing that problem, what steps can we take to address this problem, and to kind of alleviate those causes or remove those causes? Discrete brief description, so it's concluding, so overview. And then in most studies, and pretty much in any good study, there's going to be new questions that emerge. So either questions that emerge through doing the study, or next steps that need to be taken. So you haven't probably solved the entire problem, so there may be kind of follow-up studies that need to be done. So what are the directions for future research based on what the state of the literature is when you came in, and based on the contribution that you've just made, what's the future direction? All right, so selecting a research question. So kind of your first project that we're going to be having this week, your first assignment, is going to be selecting a research question. So want to review that a little bit more. So if you remember from a couple days ago, we talked about empirical studies are generally structured as follows. So kind of we have a broad question, we narrow it in. So I want to focus on kind of that, selecting a broad question or broad questions, and then narrowing it down and focusing it in. And then later on, we'll start looking at things like operationalizing and observing and analyzing and all of that stuff, and reaching conclusions. We'll talk more about that. But right now, we're kind of in the begin with broad questions and narrow focus in. So most social research is problem solving in nature, meaning that its primary goal is to solve some large social problem. However, this problem is usually too large to tackle in a single project. For example, a researcher might be interested in solving climate change. However, this is far too complicated of a problem to tackle in a single project, right? You're not going to solve all of climate change in one project. It would take multiple books. So possible topics, not exhaustive, of kind of social issues that you might be interested in that could help kind of, these are the kind of macro, like, so the broad questions or the broad problems, problems that social issues that you want to be addressing. So things like indigenous people's rights, refugees, gentrification, crime, discrimination, multiple forms of discrimination, access to healthcare, education, or other services, corporate or government corruption, unemployment, poverty, forced migration, climate change, war, economic inequality, terrorism, and there's many others. So you don't have to be choosing one of these as kind of your broad problem area. But these are just kind of possible to get you start brainstorming about what are social issues. So once we've got our social issue, though, we typically need to narrow down the project to a manageable research question, which is a central issue being addressed in the study. Your research question is really what your paper is about. Your paper is not really about the problem. I mean, it is in the sense of that's what motivated the question, but your paper really is about answering the question, and that will help you then in solving the problem and giving you more information about the problem. But your specific study is focused on the research question. So for example, if we were talking about climate change, one way we can narrow it down would be we might ask why Canada failed to meet its Kyoto targets, or why the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement, right? And so these are still, big questions, but they're ones that are manageable within a study. We're not going to be able to, there's many, many different studies that could ask this same question because there's multiple possible explanations or multiple different ways of testing each of these different explanations. But you can write a single paper, you could write a paper on either of those questions. I don't mean you, I mean somebody in general could write a paper on either of these questions, and be able to do it within kind of, an article size, and by testing one possible answer. So where do research questions come from? So practical problems in the discipline, right? So this is partially where do research questions come from, and partially where do kind of the underlying topics come from. So researchers in the social sciences often have practical experience working in their field. This allows them to identify problems from practical experience. So, a sociologist might also work kind of in social work, or have worked in the government agency. Psychologists might also have a practice, and so might understand, a political scientist may have worked in government at some point. So have kind of practical understandings of problems that exist in the relevant discipline. But also in each course that you've taken, more kind of at the practical level for you, in each course that you've taken in a social science discipline, you have learned about important topics or problems facing that discipline. So many of the courses will be focusing in on kind of some of the most important debates or issues being faced by that discipline. Excuse me. So that could be, if you kind of, your starting point could be thinking of, what social science courses have I taken? What were the important questions that they were asking? Important topics, important problems that they were looking at. You could look at literature in a specific field. So by reading what others have published in a specific social science discipline, you can find areas to extend or improve existing studies. One of the best ways to find questions to ask, and this is particularly not just about problems, this is even getting more specific to research questions. One of the best ways to find research questions is to read, and see what's existing. What is the existing research? What questions are people asking? And what answers are they proposing? Because the questions they're asking and the answers they're proposing are going to help inspire other questions. So, for example, you could be looking to extend an existing study. So while a study may provide a partial answer to part of the problem, a study will never provide the definitive answer on the problem. So perhaps a study only examined one step in a causal chain. A follow-up study could examine the next step. Or more likely, new context. A study takes place in a particular context. A follow-up study can examine whether the results apply in a different context, as long as that context is theoretically relevant. So, for example, in your case, you could take a research question that was asked, or a study that was done in the United States, and they had a research question, and they proposed a theory to it or an answer to it, and you're interested to see whether we have the same problem in Canada. So that same research question is applicable in Canada, and you're interested to see whether that theory that has been tested in the U.S. and found to be part of the cause in the U.S. it's also applicable in Canada. That's actually a really, or one that was done in Britain, or France, or Australia. That could be a really good source of a research question, and of a theory to be tested. It's taken into a different context when we want to see, there are differences in culture, in economy, in values, in politics between Canada and the US. So not all explanations that apply in the US are going to apply in Canada because of these differences. So finding the limits of different theories can be important. Now you want to make sure it's theoretically relevant. So for example, does the question make sense in Canada? So if it was asked in another country and we just don't have that problem in Canada, then it's not really an applicable question. Also, if you want to be testing out the theory, so you could still take the question and then come up with your own answer. But if you're also choosing to test that theory in a different context, you have to make sure that that theory makes sense in Canada. So, for example, for a politics one, it's assuming and it's something about, and the theory has something to do with a presidential system. Well, we don't have a presidential system in Canada. So if the theory was contingent on having a presidential system, you're going to need a different theory in Canada. You can still ask the question, potentially, but you would need a different explanation. But we'll come more to explanation later. Improve. So while a study may make important contributions to our understanding, no study is perfect. follow-up study can always try to address weaknesses in the current literature. So in terms of internal validity, did the study allow us to test causal claims? Can we be confident in the causal claims? Would a different method allow us to improve our confidence in the causal claims? So did you find problems in the existing literature in their ability to make causal claims? And can you find a way to improve it so that we can strengthen, so to solve threats to validity, to solve problems of temporal precedence, to um, uh, establish stronger correlations, all things that would allow us to make stronger causal claims. And in particular, when we're talking about though internal validity, we'd be focusing in particular on the issue of uh, eliminating alternative explanations. Construct validity: did the study operationalize its constructs properly? Are we able to make claims about the theorized constructs from the measured constructs? So depending on whatever theory that you're taking, it's going to say, democracy caused something. Is the measure of democracy something that actually fits with how the theory views democracy? If it doesn't, then we have a problem. And are you able to better measure whatever the construct is? Conclusion validity: did the study draw conclusions about relations between variables? Are you confident in those claims? Would a different research design or method of analysis allow for greater confidence? This is probably one that you guys should stay away from, just because most published studies, well, all published studies would have scholars who are better trained in statistics. While QM's a nice intro, you're not going to have the statistical kind of know-how to be able to, improve on something that's been published in an academic journal. So kind of improving on understanding of correlation or confidence in the claims about correlational relationships probably isn't something that will be feasible. But construct validity and internal validity are improvements are possible. And then just think of a research topic as kind of the final source. So we talked about thinking through kind of what you've seen in your classes, think through what you see in the academic literature, and the final is just think up a research topic. All researchers, yourselves included, live in the real world, and many research questions come from our own experiences in the world. So just looking at current events or things going on in the world, from COVID-19 to all the protests going on right now, related to kind of Black Lives Matter. So just from kind of our current day-to-day lives with those two things is a major source of topics and research questions. And so just from things that are going on in our lives, that's able to inspire, topics of problems that exist and questions that come from them. You should be thinking about when you're selecting your question, is the study feasible? When developing a research question, it's always important to think about the feasibility of the study. Do you have the resources, and in particular, in this case, the time, but also things like finances and technology to be able to answer the question, because time is a major factor, particularly in the summer session. Time is a factor. You're not going to want something too big, or that's going to involve kind of a data collection method that's just not suitable in the time you have. Will you have access to the necessary materials and populations? So again, this is going to be really important in terms of the type of questions you can ask, and come back to in a second. But like, for example, your survey, you're probably going to be implementing Canada, probably even in the Quebec or Montreal greater area context. So if you want to be asking a question about, how do Australians, a problem about if your research question is about a problem that exists in Australia, you're probably not going to have access to enough Australians to, be able to complete the study. And are there important ethical considerations that would prevent you from answering the question, right? So you've got to be thinking always along kind of the ethical lines. I'm not going to allow any studies where you're dealing with vulnerable populations and stuff like that. So certainly going to have to be your questions, like for example, any questions that are requiring studying minors won't be feasible for this particular study, and stuff like that. So think through also the ethical side. And is it just, it might be a really important question that you have, but answering it would be kind of just too high risk of causing harm. So particularly, people in crisis or something like that. So it would be it's a really important question to answer, and somebody probably will have to ask the question at some point. But for a course paper, where the benefits don't outweigh the costs. So practical considerations for the IM project. You'll be conducting a survey or survey experiment for the research project. Therefore, remember the following when selecting your problem and research question. You'll likely only have access to a Canadian sample. Therefore, Canadian public opinion should potentially be relevant in answering the question. For example, a project focused exclusively on British urban development would not be suitable, right? It could be many really important research questions potentially about British urban development, right? But you're not going to have access to, you're very unlikely to have access to the appropriate population for answering this question. So you have to be, realistic about what samples will you have access to in this amount of time with the resources that you have, and choose questions that are relevant given, what you have, what's going to be feasible for you. While you won't know your proposed answer thesis yet, it must at least be plausible that characteristics of the public can play a role in answering your question. So, for example, things like cultural, personality traits, cognition, values, attitudes, beliefs, opinions. So, for example, if the only plausible answers for your research question are beliefs of economists, you're probably not going to have access to enough economists. The structure of the Canadian government, so you want to be making a structural the answer you believe to your question is that it has to do with kind of the institutions of the Canadian government. So, how our government institutions are in. Well, you're not going to be able to survey institutions. A survey wouldn't be an appropriate method there. Population density of the city. These are all things where a survey of the public would not be a suitable method to be able to test a theory, right? So you want something where, the public can potentially be playing a role. Now, they may not be the only thing that matters. So, for example, your question, structure of the Canadian government, may be another possible answer, right? But at least the public has to be able to play some role in answering your question. So conducting a literature review, once you've got your question, the next project we're going to be starting next week is conducting a literature review. So I just wanted to touch on that now because we're not going to be having another lecture before. So a literature review is designed to identify related research to set the current research project within a conceptual and theoretical context. So, you're not going to come up with a problem that nobody has thought of. And if you do, you should be considering why nobody else has talked about it before. Is it truly a problem? If nobody has ever talked about this problem before, it's either a very new problem, you're either incredibly brilliant to be the first person to ever recognize it, but the more likely scenario is that it's just not really that big of a problem. And so, but in most cases, in pretty much everything, I've never actually seen someone come up with nobody's ever written on. You're not going to come up with something that nobody's thought of before, right? So just in terms of from the honesty perspective, but also in terms of just, helping you to write a better paper and making your life easier, right? Reading what other people have said is important. So while your narrow research question may be unique, your study is still part of a wider conversation. So even if nobody has asked about, this particular social issue in Longueuil, right? People would have asked about it in other contexts. People have asked similar questions. And so even if it's not exactly the exact same focused in research question, people have asked similar questions. So it's still fitting within a wider conversation on the problem. And so it's your responsibility as a researcher to give credit to those who've worked on the subject before, right? So other people have worked really, really hard. Um, your study is going to be guided partially by things that they've figured out. And so it's your responsibility as a researcher to give credit to them for the work that they've done, and for kind of the help that it gives you. But more than just that, it's the responsible thing to do. It's also beneficial for your study because it helps you gain a better understanding of the problem, right? By looking at kind of the things that other people have found, um, the mistakes other people have made, the things that other people have found matters in explaining it, and the things that other people have found doesn't matter in explaining it. You're going to get a better understanding of the problem, so you're going to be able to, um, design a better study, to be able to help us understand it and to increase our knowledge. It's just going to make your life easier if the more you understand on your problem, the more you understand about the question, the more you understand about what other people have proposed before. So the kind of the theories and the arguments other people have made, the more that you can understand about the methods other people have used to try to answer similar questions, uh, just the easier it's going to be for you to write a paper. So doing a good literature review, seeing what other people have done, is always really important. You can tell often, um, I can often see based on kind of the quality of the literature review, because the literature review is quite early in the paper. I can often almost guess how good the rest of the paper is going to be based on how well you can see the person's read up on the topic. Some tips: begin the literature review as early as possible. You'll make better choices at every stage if you understand what others have done, right? So that's why I put right after you come up with your question, I want you to become as quickly as possible, not complete experts, but at least very, very knowledgeable on your topic, and not just the topic largely, but the topic related to your specific research question. You want to be focusing on the scientific literature, peer-reviewed journal articles, and academic books. So the scientific literature goes through a rigorous process before publication. It doesn't mean that everything that they say is right. It doesn't mean that there aren't errors. It doesn't mean there's not sometimes dishonesty within the scientific literature. And there certainly are errors because people are continually learning more, and so studies get updated and corrected, and there's debates, and not everybody can be right in these debates. But there should at least be a minimum standard of quality, which outside the scientific literature you can't guarantee. And we want to give credit to those who actually conducted the studies, right? And textbooks and encyclopedias can be reporting on interesting questions and theories and whatnot, but the people writing it aren't actually the people who did the studies. And we want to be giving credit to the people who actually did the studies. It's also really good to be looking at the person who originally did it, because sometimes the way a textbook or encyclopedia explains a study and what they found, right? Sometimes and a textbook's going to explain the result of somebody conducted a study and they found this, and then you go and actually read the study, and what they found is either not as strong, it doesn't justify the way that the textbook wrote it up, or it's actually misleadingly different from the way that the textbook wrote it up. And that you're actually going to find, or encyclopedia or in review pieces, you're actually going to find is actually quite common, because anytime you try to distill the essence of a study of, a journal article is often about 30 pages. Anytime you try to distill, a 30-page study down into 2 sentences or 3 sentences, right, something's going to get lost. So you're going to get a better understanding of what's actually done if you just go to the scientific literature. Begin by finding, so this is kind of my favorite way of starting. This is the way that I go about it, is I begin by finding a study or two, 1 to 3 studies, but even just one for a starting point that's quite similar to the one you're considering, right? So don't just take the first study if you do a search that's at all relevant to your topic. Find one that really seems to be linked to your research question, like as specific as possible. So do spend a little bit of time finding one that you think is going to be incredibly useful for you. The closer to your research question, the better. And that's kind of your starting point. And then you should look at 2 things. So one, you should read the study. But the second is you should look at 2 other things to help you grow your literature review. Look at who they cite, right? So they're, again, not probably going to be the first person writing on it. And so they had to do a literature review of their own, right? So they're providing you ready categorized list of sources. So look at their literature review, look at their bibliography, right? And then find studies within there that seem to be relevant. So they're already kind of narrowing the literature down to things that are potentially relevant. And then look at who cited them. And Google Scholar, so you can get that, you can just Google Scholar. And so if you look at a study there, it's going to have a button under each study cited by. And if you click it, it's going to kind of provide a list of everyone who has cited it. So by looking at the bibliography, you can look at what came before that study that you found. And by looking at the cited by, you can see all the studies that came after it within that conversation. So if you want to start learning about the conversation on your research question, you then have a full timeline kind of works. And then from there, you could very quickly end up with a massive number of studies potential. Not all of them are going to be useful, right? Because sometimes they're going to be citing stuff that aren't going to be relevant to your research question, or sometimes they're going to get cited by people who maybe are citing them because of the method they used and not because of the research question. So it's not to say that everything within those are going to be relevant to you, but it's going to be a really easy way to narrow it down. If you do that with a couple of different studies, you're just going to really quickly have a really good list of stuff. So students are often daunted by, how do I find something so, good sources? All you really have to be able to do is find one really quality one, and then the rest becomes a lot easier. All right, so that's it for today's lecture. So remember, I'm going to be posting the first assignment, which you're going to be able to start working on on your group on Friday. So it'll be kind of your first group meeting. I'll be posting what your groups are since I'm selecting them. And so you'll be able to come up with your topic and your research question. So have a really great day.